Welcome to today's edition of the Rush 24/7 podcast.
Okay, here we go, folks. A lot to do today. I'm telling you right up front, a lot to do today. On the Excellence in Broadcasting Network, Rush Limbaugh, 800-282-2882. If you want to be on the program, the email address, lrushbo@eibnet.us. I now know who the spy is. I now knew who the FBI was running in the Trump campaign. I don't think I'm going to give you the name of the spy, but I'm going to tell you everything the spy has done. It is the most amazing story. It is a story of entrapment. When you hear this, it's going to infuriate you. You're going to realize how utterly phony this entire investigation of Donald Trump is. It's phonier than you even realize now. And there is a Cliff Notes version of this, and there is the intricate, detailed version of this. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version when we get into this. The name of the spy, I mean, you might or might not know it. It's not somebody that would you hear the name. It's not. It's not that kind of person. Even to call the person a spy is a little bit of a stretch. It's more like an operative employed by the FBI to basically entrap somebody who worked with the Trump campaign in a peripheral way. And it worked like a charm. And it all involves the name George Papadopoulos. Does the name George Papadopoulos ring a bell? George Papadopoulos is the so-called second reason the Mueller investigation or the FBI investigation into Trump colluding with Russia began. The first reason we were given was Carter Page. A FISA warrant, as you know, was secured to spy on Carter Page because of the Steele dossier. But nothing came of Mr. Page. The New York Times, over the New Year's weekend, 2017-2018, wrote a story saying that actually it was something else that triggered everything, and that was George Papadopoulos. They dropped Carter Page entirely, and using the media, they attempted to say that the when the Steele dossier was exposed as a fraud, when it was exposed as an opposition research document, the intelligence people, the FBI, DOJ, went into stage 2, came up with a new reason, ostensibly, to trigger the investigation. Turns out it wasn't Carter Page, it was George Papadopoulos. And do you remember what they said Papadopoulos did? Papadopoulos got drunk one night at a bar in London and started talking to somebody who just happened to be an ambassador from Australia. And Papadopoulos told this guy that the Russians had thousands of Hillary Clinton emails. The New York Times weekend story, New Year's weekend in 2017-2018, stressed that is what actually triggered the investigation. Well, Papadopoulos was entrapped by 3 people, including the person who is reputed to be the spy. And very simply, here's the Cliff Notes version of what happened. George Papadopoulos, a 24-year-old peripheral member of the Trump foreign policy campaign team. He was a nothing. He was a nobody, which made him a perfect mark. He was a young guy who wanted to go places. On his resume, trying to get jobs with governments and campaigns, he actually put on his resume that he had participated in Model UN in high school and college. The spy, the operative, sent this guy from the UK, sent this guy an invitation to write a paper on things about Turkey and Cyprus and some other things, offered to pay him $3,000 and his plane ticket to the UK. Before that happened, another operative had informed Papadopoulos that the Russians had Hillary Clinton emails. Papadopoulos did not independently know this. He was told this by a Russian spy or a person connected to the Russians whose name is Mifsud. Mifsud operates with the person thought to be the FBI's informant on the Trump campaign and the Australian ambassador. So some months before Papadopoulos was offered this research paper and speech by the informant, he was paid $3,000 for it, his plane ticket to Europe. Sometime before that, this Mifsud guy happened to see, Papadopoulos was set up and targeted. And he was told, by the way, Russians have 3,000 or a bunch of Hillary emails, thousands of Hillary emails. Papadopoulos keeps it close to the vest, doesn't say anything about it, but thinks it's really cool that somebody's letting him in on things. In other words, Papadopoulos, reputedly the source and the reason, the second explanation for the investigation, only knew, supposedly, the Russians don't have Hillary. We don't even know that that's true. But they planted that news with him to set him up. It's, folks, it is, this is entrapment like you cannot believe. So Papadopoulos, when he's given this offer of $3,000 to do a lecture and write a report by the FBI's informant, he already knows, because he's been told by this Mifsud fellow, that the Russians have thousands of Hillary emails. So when he is summoned, and Papadopoulos himself says this invitation to write this paper and come to the UK and be given $3,000 came out of the blue. He couldn't figure it out. Why me? He was asking himself. But he accepted and he went over. And he met with the informant. And during a conversation, the informant said, George, do you remember? Does it ring a bell? The Russians have thousands of Hillary emails. You remember this? So now Papadopoulos is hearing it for the second time. But he doesn't know that he's talking to an informant for the FBI, a quote-unquote spy. So after that, the informant gets hold of the Australian ambassador and suggests to him that he meet Papadopoulos at a London bar, which happens. Papadopoulos gets liquored up, gets drunk. This is factually known. It's been reported. And Papadopoulos starts bragging to the Australian ambassador. Hey, did you know that the Russians have thousands of emails? Papadopoulos passed this information along as though it were his own. He was just trying to fit in. He was just trying to be a big guy. Papadopoulos telling this story to the Australian ambassador is what triggered this as news. Papadopoulos did not independently know this. He was fed this information. He was used to be a Trump campaign official to make the statement to the Australian ambassador, who could then report to the FBI DOJ that a member of the Trump campaign has been saying that the Russians have thousands of Hillary's emails. The whole thing was a setup. It was designed perfect entrapment 101. When Papadopoulos was questioned about this with the FBI, he lied about some things, and that's why Mueller indicted him, convicted him, and he was found guilty of lying to the FBI because at some point he realized what was going on. Now, the important thing to remember here is that Papadopoulos was a peripheral member of the Trump campaign. He didn't know anything officially. He wasn't close enough to anybody to know anything. He's 24, 25 years old, whatever, but he was never had day-to-day contact with Trump. He didn't have day-to-day contact with the Trump campaign foreign policy team, none of that. He was targeted because he was a young, eager beaver. He was targeted, and he was set up, and he was entrapped. The informant and Mifsud implant the news with Papadopoulos that the Russians have thousands of Hillary emails. He's hearing this essentially from people working, unbeknownst to him, with the FBI and the DOJ. And so he gets drunk one night in a bar with the Australian ambassador, which was also set up, and passes that information along as though it's its own, that he knows it as a Trump campaign person. And that provided an opportunity for the FBI, the DOJ, to say the Trump campaign knew that Hillary had. It enabled the FBI, DOJ to lie that the Trump campaign knew that the Russians had 3,000 or thousands of Hillary Clinton emails. It is no different than Comey going to the Oval Office to tell Trump about the salacious elements of the Steele dossier, which then enabled the media to report about the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier had nothing in it. It was factual, still hasn't been confirmed. And because of that, they had to drop it. They had to drop the FISA warrant on Page. It wasn't going anywhere. They needed another so-called reason to conduct this investigation. Papadopoulos was the mark. So just as James Comey tells the president, well, James Comey was instructed by Clapper to tell the president about the dossier. Comey has admitted in interviews that was his assignment. He didn't tell Trump who paid for the dossier. His assignment was to tell Trump it existed. After he did that, Comey tells Clapper, mission accomplished. Clapper calls CNN. CNN reports the Steele dossier and that Trump knows about it. That's how that story begins. They get a Pulitzer Prize for this. Or there's some kind of award from the White House Correspondents Association. This thing with Papadopoulos is no different than that. And there might be two other people that have been set up as Papadopoulos was. Page might be, his involvement here might be the result of a setup or sting as well. Now, that's the Cliff Notes version of this. The detailed version is more harrowing, and it'll tick you off. And what you conclude, what we all conclude when this is over, is that there is nothing real in this investigation, that every aspect of this investigation might look at this Papadopoulos story as the insurance policy that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were texting each other about, back and forth. Remember when she was saying that better keep out the possibility Trump could win? No, there's no way. She was saying, I don't know. And Strzok said, well, then we need an insurance policy. The Papadopoulos thing may well be the insurance policy. But the thing to know here is that George Papadopoulos did not know that the Russians had thousands of Hillary Clinton emails until he was told by the informant, the FBI informant, who was ratting on, implanted in the Trump campaign. Was actually told about it by a friend of the informant's, this Mifsud fellow, M-I-F-S-U-D, who has ties to Russian intelligence. May, in fact, be a Russian agent, but he does double duty. He may be the first person to actually tell Papadopoulos about it. Then the informant, the so-called spy, calls Papadopoulos, invites him to London to write a research paper, deliver a speech on the research paper, for which he'd be paid $3,000 and airfare. And while in London on this bogus, distracting mission of a lecture, the informant says, George, remember that story? Have you heard about the Russians got thousands of Hillary's emails? So he hears it for the second time now. He hears it from the informant, and before that, the informant's buddy Mifsud. So now Papadopoulos thinks he's onto something, but he keeps it close to the vest until he has a night at a bar in London with the Australian ambassador, who, by the way, is a huge donor to the Clinton Foundation. He gets liquored up, and he starts bragging to the Australian ambassador that We know the Russians have 3,000. I keep saying 3,000. That's the fee was paid. Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails. That then became the FBI, the DOJ, telling the media, a Trump campaign official has informed us, has been talking about the fact that they know in the Trump campaign that Russia has Hillary's emails. That is what triggered the second phase of the investigation after the Steele dossier was outed. Remember, Papadopoulos did not independently know this. He was fed this information. He was entrapped with it. Young guy, wants to matter. They gave him what he thought was super tight news, big news. Not very many people knew it. He felt really important. They were tugging him close to the vest. They liked him. They trusted him. He thinks he's onto something here. Can't wait to brag about it. And he did to the Australian ambassador. The Australian ambassador then followed the script. So guess what? The Trump campaign's bragging about all these emails that they know of Hillary that the Russians have. Bam! Second phase of the investigation triggered. New York Times report. George Papadopoulos, drunk one night in London bar, informs blah, blah from Australia that the Russians... And that's how that all happened. That's just one story involving the so-called spy or informant. It's all trumped up, folks. No pun intended. None of it's real. All of it was made up. It was simply created to permit an investigation. Just like Comey telling Trump the dossier existed served as the mechanism to get the media in the clear to report on the dossier. This thing is more fake. This whole investigation is more fake and more phony, more connived than you could possibly imagine. Be back after this. Yeah, welcome back. I'm going to run through all of this again and get into more detail. Now that you know the Cliff Notes version and have a foundation for understanding, we'll get to that in the next segment. Big day. The embassy in Jerusalem officially opening today. You know, Donald Trump has run out of promises. He's kept all his promises, and now he's having to keep promises other presidents have made, including Obama, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. We have the hostage release in North Korea. We got Kim Jong-un promising to de-nuke his country and to show everybody in a ceremony when it's happening. We have the upcoming summit. We have trade negotiations redone. We trade agreements renegotiated. We are pulling out of the Iran-Obama deal. We're pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. We have a possible Middle East peace agreement. What has not been reported is that the Trump administration has a peace proposal for Israel and the Palestinians following the opening of the embassy today in Jerusalem when the time is right. We have the economy roaring. We have tax cuts. The Democrats are puzzled why people aren't angry at them. Record small business profits. We have jobs for everyone. In addition, we have David Brooks of the New York Times writing, you know what? It could well be that Trump's experience in New York working with mobbed-up construction people has prepared him better to deal with thugs around the world and all of these Ivy League-educated people. We have Willie Brown, the former mayor of San Francisco, who ran the California State Assembly, warning the Democrats Trump is much more popular all over the country than they are understanding and that they are trending in the exact wrong direction. Other Democrats are coming out in the New York Times and warning against this idea of a big blue wave. And that just scratches the surface today. By the way, in about a half hour, beginning of the next hour, Brett Baier of Fox News' new book out called 3 Days in Moscow. It's about Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Union. And we'll be talking to Brett, as I say, in a half hour. Now, let me get into a little bit more detail. I know the Jerusalem thing is a big story. Everything happening is a big story. But this, to me, since this is the mechanism by which the deep state is attempting to get rid of Donald Trump, and since the news hit last week from Kimberly Strassel that there was a spy, an FBI informant in the Trump campaign, I have been singularly focused on ferreting all of this out. and spent most of Saturday afternoon doing it. And I just gave you the Cliff Notes version of this. Now, the thing to remember, the first thing to remember in this is that there are two triggers of the investigation. Call it the Mueller investigation, call it the deep state attempt to expose Trump-Russia collusion. The first phase of this, and what it turns out to be is the first attempt at this, was getting a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page. It looks like Carter Page was also fed information that he ended up talking about that then facilitated the deep state to go, wow, look what this guy knows, when they're the ones that fed him the information. Carter Page also didn't know anything from Shinola about the Trump campaign or collusion. He was set up as well. So the Steele dossier is floating around. Everybody in Washington knows it, and they also know it can't be verified. But they think it's gold. They know that it's Hillary Clinton opposition research, but they're not telling anybody that. They go to the FISA court and get a warrant to spy on Page, given that he is supposedly the link between Trump and Russia and collusion. Well, after the FISA warrant was granted and the spying began, then the news hit that the dossier is a fraud. It's a fault. It's a fraud. It's a fake. It's a Hillary Clinton opposition research. So the investigators, the deep state, know that at the end of the day, this isn't going to work. They're not going to be able to get rid of Trump. They're not going to be able to drive his numbers down on a dossier that is actual opposition research of Trump's political opponent. They need something else to trigger the idea that Trump colluded with Russia to sustain the investigation, which really is not going to have much substance to it because of the discovery of the phoniness of the dossier. Enter George Papadopoulos. Now, I don't know if you remember, but I do. Out of nowhere, all of a sudden, Mueller indicts this guy, and we start hearing about Papadopoulos supposedly having information as a member of the Trump campaign that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton's hacked emails. And I said to myself, Papadopoulos? Who is George Papadopoulos? Is this a stretch or is this a stretch? Never heard of the guy. Nobody else had heard of the guy. But it was this knowledge that permitted Mueller and the deep state to essentially restart the investigation. The New York Times had a massive story over the New Year's weekend explaining the Papadopoulos angle. And they said in that story, it was reported that Papadopoulos actually was the trigger for the investigation in the first place, way back in July of 2016, not Carter Page. If you remember, when Papadopoulos' name surfaced, the FBI, the DOJ, the media, they all said, oh, no, it wasn't the dossier. It wasn't Page. That's incidental. Papadopoulos is where this all began. The electronic communication between John Brennan and the investigators at the FBI, including Comey, mentioning Papadopoulos, that's where this began, they said. Okay. If you don't forget that throughout everything else that you now hear, because Papadopoulos was set up. He was entrapped. Papadopoulos didn't know anything about the Russians having hacked Hillary's emails or being in possession of 3,000 or thousands of them. He didn't know a thing about that. That information was planted. That information was told him by the informant that the FBI supposedly has in the Trump campaign. The informant extends an invitation to Papadopoulos to come to London. He's going to be paid $3,000 in airfare to write a paper on immigration involving Turkey and Cyprus, something entirely nebulous. They needed to get him to London. He had been targeted as a young, eager beaver who didn't know anything, who wanted to go someplace. They targeted him as somebody they could plant information, and he would use it as they intended if he could get guided properly, and he was. So the informant calls him. This is it's tricky here in one regard because there's another person. It may be another informant. This guy's name is Mifsud. Joseph Mifsud. Mifsud is he's a Russian-tied agent and spy who has connections to MI6 in the UK, and it's this guy who first informed Papadopoulos about these emails the Russians had. So the informant calls Papadopoulos and makes this big offer. Papadopoulos was curious about the motivation. He didn't quite understand why he was being sought out because he didn't know these people. It seemed very random to him. But then it all started to make sense once he accepted this. He spent a lot of time in London because these people got him there under the false premise that they wanted to see what he would write and lecture about immigration and foreign policy in some of these other Asian European countries. So after Papadopoulos accepts the invitation and is in the United Kingdom, the informant on one occasion said to Papadopoulos, "George, you know about hacking the emails from Russia, right? You've heard about that." Well, Papadopoulos had because he had been informed by the informant's friend, Mifsud. It was the informant/spy who sought out Papadopoulos and mentioned the existence of the emails. At this point, we have to bring in the Russian ambassador, a guy named Downer, Alexander Downer, who then gets himself introduced to Papadopoulos through Joseph Mifsud, who has also told Papadopoulos about these phantom emails. Downer, the ambassador from Australia and a donor to the Clinton Foundation, and Papadopoulos go out drinking one night. Papadopoulos starts bragging about knowing about these emails that the Russians have, Hillary Clinton emails. Downer knows that Papadopoulos has been told about this by his two buddies, the informant and his friend. Downer is a complicit player in this. He didn't just happen to be randomly drinking with Papadopoulos one night at a bar. They were set up to go there together so that Papadopoulos hopefully would brag to him about these emails that he, Papadopoulos, knew. When Papadopoulos came through and did this then enabled Alexander Downer to report to the Americans, the FBI, the DOJ, that there's somebody from the Trump campaign in London running around bragging about all of these emails he knows that the Russians have. So it's a circle. Papadopoulos in the middle as the person entrapped. And it is Papadopoulos was set up, including getting him drunk, so that he would talk about the Hillary emails that they had told him about. Papadopoulos had been informed by Joseph Mifsud. Again, this guy is a London-based academic who professed to have Kremlin connections. And he is introduced to Papadopoulos after the informant invites him over, or the invitation is made to Papadopoulos to do this lecture, to write this piece. That then opens up a channel of communication between Mifsud and Papadopoulos. So before Papadopoulos even arrives in London, Mifsud informs him of the emails that the Russians have, the Hillary emails that the Russians hacked. So Papadopoulos is told this before he even arrives in London. I want to make that clear. Then he gets to London, accepting the invitation of the informant spy, who then happens to ask, "George, you remember this story, right, about the Russians hacking Hillary's emails, and they have them? You remember?" "Oh, yeah, of course I do." So Papadopoulos had been informed by Joseph Mifsud, London-based academic who professed to have Kremlin connections. A few weeks later, drinking in a London bar, this is May of 2016, Papadopoulos blabbed the news to Alexander Downer. And that's essentially the story. Now, it's been confirmed, by the way, if you go back and look at Glenn Simpson testimony, private testimony, behind closed doors testimony, to House and Senate committees, he alludes to all of this in a roundabout way. Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS. I mean, the more detail I go into there, the more convoluted the story gets because we're skipping back and forth in time. But if you, like I said, it took me a number of hours on Saturday to put this all together. And I'm not the only one who has. Please don't misunderstand. I'm telling you everything but the informant's name. I've even gone to some websites who hate Trump, UK websites that hate Trump, who love the informant. The informant's an Oxford professor. He's typical establishment elitist person in his 70s. And he comes from the whole elitist establishment crowd, which would be appalled at somebody like Donald Trump being elected. He's got ties to U.S. politics, has dual citizenship. He has UK citizenship and American citizenship and has served in American administrations, widely known to American intelligence people and the FBI. And he was asked to perform this mission with Papadopoulos. And it simply, at its base level, is a story of entrapment. Papadopoulos then is questioned by Mueller about all of this. When the news hits that it was Papadopoulos rambling in a bar in London that actually triggered the investigation, that's what Mueller and Rosenstein, everybody wants us to believe it was Papadopoulos, not Carter Page, not the FISA warrant, not the Steele dossier. They're trying to make us believe that those things are not what really triggered this. They're incidental. The dossier is incidental. Carter Page is incidental. Papadopoulos is the reason all this happened. Papadopoulos is the guy that had the news that Trump campaign knew that the Russians had hacked emails from Hillary and may have had something to do with it. That's what they're saying triggered this investigation in July of 2016. And I can tell you assuredly that it's all bogus. That Papadopoulos was entrapped and set up and didn't independently know this. And in fact, it's not ever been established that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails. That, too, likely has been totally made up to fit this narrative, this intricately woven web of deceit. The trigger point for this, the thing everybody's looking at, is the electronic communication that got all of this started, and that triggers back to John Brennan, who was Obama's CIA director, who even admitted one day on Meet the Press, he was asked by Chuck Todd, look, this information that we have here, did this all come to you from the Five Eyes, which is our European and Australian allies, who help us with intelligence? And Brennan said, well, no, not really. You know, we're really, really tight with British intel. And he was really huffing and puffing and trying to remain uncommitted. But he, in his answer, focused on the idea that they really had assistance here, were really being aided by British intel. Well, that's the informant spy that everybody now believes Brennan was referring to, not by name, of course, because at this point they all thought they were getting away with this. Anyway, you're probably going to see a whole bunch of people writing about this. Chuck Ross at the Daily Caller has written a lot of this in an article back in March, it turns out, including the name of the informant spy, although he didn't tag him as such. Ross didn't back in March. Look, I'm way long here. I've got to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. Now, folks, everything I've just told you is what Devin Nunes at the House Intelligence Committee is trying to get confirmed. And evidence of this is what has been redacted by Rosenstein and the DOJ. You know, Nunes has been seeking, via subpoena, all of the records relevant to this, and the DOJ has been stonewalling and refusing, and Rosenstein saying, I will not be extorted, and so forth. But if you read the House Intelligence Committee report, and I took a stab at it, it's 252 pages, there's so many redactions in this thing, and some of it is the four names. Carter Page's name is public, but it is believed the three other targets of this whole operation are Papadopoulos, Paul Manafort, and his buddy Page, Greg, his buddies. He's also been indicted along with Manafort. Those are the four. And Nunes is striving to get this stuff unredacted. Now, in addition to the informant, so-called spy, I have in the process here gotten very interested in this Joseph Mifsud person. His name is all over this. He was the first person to tell George Papadopoulos about the fact the Russians had thousands of Hillary Clinton hacked emails. Nobody has ever confirmed the Russians have anything of Hillary's, by the way. This is a made-up story. He's a Maltese professor. He's based in London, claims to have Kremlin contacts. He is who told Papadopoulos the Kremlin had thousands of emails of Hillary Clinton. He travels in the same intelligence, foreign policy, academic circles as all of these other people in this story. We don't know that he's really a Russian agent. How do we know that his targeting of Papadopoulos was on behalf of Russia? We don't know that. Could have been on behalf of the FBI. But that's pretty much where we are with this as of today. So I think all this was passed on to Brennan and the CIA. And that's where the electronic communication originated to start this whole thing. Okay, look, Brett Baer coming up when we get back from the break at the top of the hour with his new book. Don't go away. And we are back. Great to have you with us, my friends. Rush Limbaugh and the EIB Network. Telephone number is 800-282-2882. We'll get to your phone calls as quickly as we can in this hour, but we seldom have any guests on this program because there just isn't time. And there aren't that many people whose opinion I care to hear anyway, since I am the world's foremost expert. But we have exceptions, and one of them is Brett Baer. The host of Special Report with Brett Baer on Fox News every night, 6 p.m. Eastern, out with his next book called 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan, Fall of the Soviet Empire. Welcome back to the program, sir. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, Rush. Thanks for having me.
When do you find time to do this, Brett? I have the Fox News channel on here constantly. You're not just on at 6 o'clock. You're there throughout the day to comment whenever warranted.
Yeah, I'm a night owl. So after the kids get to bed, I put in a couple hours a night. So I figured I should put the pedal to the metal if it's working.
Well, this is a mammoth effort. And what inspired you? What made you curious, particularly at this time? I mean, we could probably draw a lot of parallels to Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Union to what Trump is doing now with North Korea. Maybe we can get there. But what made you want to go into this area?
Yeah, so the last book, and thank you for having me on last time, the 3 Days in January, Dwight Eisenhower's final mission. I kind of looked at the last 3 days of the Eisenhower administration before the Kennedy inauguration and that farewell address that was largely overlooked at the time, and then bounced back and looked at Eisenhower's life up until that point. So I wanted, it worked. The blueprint worked, I thought, and I wanted to get another historical moment like that maybe was overlooked at the time, and I found it in this fourth summit between Mikhail Gorbachev and President Reagan in Moscow. And it's the first time he goes to Soviet soil. We have great nuggets and details that have never come out about that summit and about behind the scenes, talking to folks like George Shultz and Marlon Fitzwater and people who were there. And then a speech that was overlooked at the time to Moscow State University students. Reagan delivers and then does Q&A with the students. Use that 3 days and bounce back to Reagan's life and how he gets to that moment. And, soon after that moment, not because of that moment, but soon after it, the wall falls, communism falls apart, and the world changes.
You found information, nuggets of information never revealed before. I don't want to give away the book, but can you share a couple with us? And how were you able to get them? I mean, this is quite a while ago that this happened. There have been a lot of people that have written about Reagan. How did you dig in and find this stuff?
Great interviews. First of all, George Shultz is a national treasure. He, at his age, remembers meetings like they were yesterday. Had a great interview with him. Had other interviews, as I mentioned, but there's also oral histories that have not been tapped, really, at the University of Virginia that go back into this time. Chris Wallace, my colleague, was on this trip, provided some interesting details. Andrew Mitchell, others. But here's something that's pretty interesting, and you talk about today, how it factors in. So remember the Berlin Wall speech. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Well, nobody wanted Reagan to say those words. No one. All of his advisors really were against it inside the White House. There's a lot of angst about it. They begged, it was too inflammatory. It would set back negotiations. Reagan didn't listen to them. And as he's in the limo on the way to the wall, he turns to an aide inside the limo and says, "The boys at State are going to kill me, but it's the right thing to do." He delivers that line. The sky didn't fall. 5 months later, Gorbachev comes to Washington to sign this nuclear arms treaty. 2 years later, the wall is gone. And you could kind of connect, that kind of same strength in words to what President Trump did at the UN speech. He threw in Rocket Man. There have been some tweets that really raised some eyebrows. Everyone thought we were going to war with North Korea, and June 12th is now this summit in Singapore. June 12th, by the way, 1987, is the day that Reagan delivers tear down this wall speech at the Berlin Wall.
Wow, that's eerie.
There's a lot of those things. There's when Reagan is walking with Gorbachev in Red Square, a lot of people around him, and Marlon Fitzwater whispers in his ear, all of these are KGB officers dressed as civilians. Well, one of them, with a camera around his neck, is Vladimir Putin.
Huh. No kid. What did you learn about Reagan that you didn't know as you're sourcing this book?
Well, I learned that, first of all, a lot of people didn't give him credit. That everybody knew that, but you didn't really know as much once you dig into it. If you go back to his early days, even as he's president of the Screen Actors Guild, he's fighting communism back then. He's testifying on Capitol Hill. It drove him. It was a part of his races, not only for governor, but also for president. And that terminology, the speeches that say, communism will be on the ash heap of history, that the Soviet Union is the evil empire, that boldness enables him to negotiate once he sees a leader who will do it. And you have to have a dance partner, and Mikhail Gorbachev was that.
He really thought that the Soviet Union would implode of its own immorality. He thought history would see to that happening, which I always understood to be one of the things that made Reagan bold and guided him with this. But these analogies that you've made are quite interesting. In Reagan, you have somebody, the boys at State were quaking in their boots. Oh, no, the guy is going to get us in trouble. You mean he's recording a Saturday radio address, and he's joking the bombing starts in 5 minutes. They start having conniption fits over that. The parallels to Donald Trump. Just over the weekend, I think David Brooks, New York Times, writes that maybe we've misunderstood Trump. Maybe because of his time spent with the mob in New York City construction, he better understands the thugs of the world.
They're different personalities, clearly. I mean, they do it differently. Trump is a counterpuncher from New York in the rough and tumble real estate world. Reagan had a different experience, but you're right. There's similarities. In the last word in the book, the chapter I wrote, and remember, I wrote it a couple months ago, but I talk about the soaring speeches Trump has delivered, in Poland, in Riyadh, the United Nations speech, State of the Union, talking about Afghanistan. Some of those speeches you can actually hear Reagan-esque language that Trump delivers, and critics would say, well, he's just reading for a teleprompter. They said that about Reagan, too. But those words eventually moved the world. Now, we'll see what happens with the negotiation in Singapore, whether the president will get up if the deal's not right, like Reagan did numerous times in negotiations. But it's worth looking at the past to learn about the future.
Talking with Brett Baer of Fox News, new book, 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan, the Fall of the Soviet Empire. Yeah, Reagan stood up and walked out of Reykjavik, and it was your new friend George Shultz who, after that had happened, said that he had never been prouder of his president than that day. Well, the rest of the world was quaking in their boots. Reagan had walked out. It meant war. And, you know, the parallels as you discuss it here, and I know they're different men, and I know that they have different approaches, Reagan and Trump, but what's consistently common here is that the establishment in Washington distrusted Reagan, distrusts Trump, actually actively dislikes Trump. But in both instances, Trump to date and Reagan over 8 years proved that their methods were successful in ways that the establishment didn't think even possible.
Exactly. I mean, in both cases, the establishment's heads are exploding day in, day out. Whether it's something said, something tweeted, you know, in both cases. Now, right now, it's supercharged with social media and everything else. Obviously, investigation's ongoing. We don't know what we don't know, but it is supercharged the environment. But one thing you can say is like Reagan, Trump has changed the paradigm. I mean, the jury's still out on the end result, but the game changed in the way Washington worked or what was important once he took office.
Did you learn, as you were reporting this book, did you learn what Reagan thought of the media, thinking Gorbachev was the answer to all the problems, that Gorbachev was the star of the two, that Gorbachev, it was his shoulders on which the hope for peace rested, and that Reagan was just the amiable dunce? Did you ever find out what Reagan or his people thought about those characterizations?
Yeah, well, not only Reagan's own writing, where he talked about it, he was less about making it about him. Marlon Fitzwater swore that he was always about, you know, I can win him over, don't worry about the negative stuff. But there was a lot of negative stuff, and you're right. Gorbachev was portrayed as this media darling, someone who was going to run circles around Reagan in those summits. It didn't happen. Gorbachev had a moment, you may remember, when he's in Washington. He gets out of the car on Connecticut Avenue and goes to these little sandwich shops, and people are coming out of the woodwork and saying, Gorby, Gorby, and chanting. And Reagan's watching it on TV as he's waiting for Gorbachev to come to the White House. Reagan goes to Moscow and has a similar moment, decides that he and Nancy are going to walk out to the Arbat in the square, and he stands on a food cart, and he starts talking to people, and everyone swamps out, thousands of people, and they're chanting, Reagan, Reagan. So he kind of put it back to Gorbachev in that moment. And one funny quick thing from that moment, you know, the Russian Secret Service, essentially, their equivalent, was beating people back eventually, and it got really kind of tough. And Nancy Reagan, the press pool was following them. Nancy Reagan grabs Helen Thomas because she's getting pushed off to the side, and they finally make it back to the Spaso house, and everyone's breathing deep. And everyone turns to the Reagans. They say, well, what do you think? And Nancy Reagan turns to Marlon Fitzwater and says, how do you think it went? And Fitzwater doesn't miss a beat, and he says, well, we lost our last best chance to get rid of Helen Thomas.
Okay. Brett, were Reagan and Gorbachev buddies in the end? I know that Gorbachev had a very close relationship with George H.W. Bush, who succeeded Reagan. And I actually met Gorbachev at one of Bush's birthday parties in Houston. And they were very tight. What about Reagan and Gorbachev at this phase of relations, which is the period of time for your book?
Yeah. So they had an amazing relationship in that they would joke with each other. They had personal rapport with each other. But when it came down to, you know, push comes to shove, he did not step away. You know, there was one point where they were going over some specifics, and he refused, Reagan did, to budge on this one issue. And Gorbachev flies into a rage, yelling and waving his finger in Reagan's face in front of everybody. So they're standing toe-to-toe. Reagan's taller than Gorbachev. He's looking down at him, and he just simply calmly says, no, I'm not going to do it. And the people in the room described like it could have been a fist fight. But Gorbachev turns and says, okay. And they had a relationship, but they were really tough negotiators at the table.
You have a couple more minutes. I got to take a break. I'd love to ask you about your interview with James Comey if you have time.
Sure.
If you don't, that's fine. I didn't mean to spring
No, I
this
do.
on.
For
okay,
you,
cool.
yes.
Brett Baer and his new book, 3 Days in Moscow, following up the book on Eisenhower and the farewell speech, which is just a kill. You've got a great format here. 3 days in, 3 days. One day it's going to be 3 days with the EIB network. We'll be back here with Brett Baer just a second. Don't go away, folks. And we're back with Brett Baer of Fox News. His new book hits tomorrow. It is 3 Days in Moscow. And it's Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Empire. You had a fascinating interview with James Comey, and this is not puffery here, but yours was the first that was actually probing in the sense that you did not treat him as a fellow traveler or an ally. Did you get suspicious when you get this text saying he's in traffic and he's going to miss the Open?
Yeah. There's a lot of traffic in Washington. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it was a big interview, obviously, and I'd been prepping for it for a long time. He came in about 12 minutes late, and we rejiggered the show and kind of moved things around. And my staff is spectacular. And so we tap danced until he arrived, and then I went back to exactly what I was going to ask before. We ran out of little time analysis-wise at the back end of the show. I wanted to have more panel time, but I got through most of what I wanted to ask him.
Well, you really made some news when you're the first person to whom he said that he still doesn't to this day know that, for example, the Steele dossier was Clinton administration or Clinton campaign opposition research. That's documented fact. And he's still out there talking to you as I still don't know that.
Right. I was taken aback by that, as you could tell by my question. I said, well, what do you mean? Wouldn't you want to know that? And his point back essentially was, I knew it was anti-Trump, whether it came from the Democrats or not, but I would think you would want to know that. The other thing that struck me was the Michael Flynn stuff, in that he told lawmakers that his people didn't believe that Michael Flynn was intentionally lying by, the experts judging him. When I asked him about that, he said he didn't know where that came from. Yeah,
but now we've what is Grassley and they've all said that he told them behind closed doors that nobody thought that Flynn had told lies in that interview, which was a crazy interview anyway. Flynn didn't even know it was an interview. He thought it was just a meeting involving the FBI and the transition. You had to know during that interview that you had a significant percentage of America hoping that you would uncover a lot of things that Comey was getting away with by not being asked about them on the other networks. How do you think you did at the end of it? Were you satisfied with it?
Yeah, I was satisfied. I mean, obviously you're critical and wanted to follow up more, and if I had 10 more minutes, and you kind of second guess. But overall, I think I was firm but fair. And, I mean, that's actually what he said at the commercial break, was that these are tough questions, but they're fair questions. And that's really what I'm going for, Rush, is hold both sides accountable.
I want to ask you this, but I'm kind of doubting you're going to answer it. But what was your impression of him after the interview? His truthfulness, his involvement, his motivations. What did you think when you finished? When he stood
up to leave, I thought, one, he clearly was evasive on some of the answers, if not, saying something completely different than what he told lawmakers. Two, I'm just surprised after that interview and after the media stretch that we've seen that he wrote the book now. And why now? And I can't imagine that Bob Mueller and his team are fired up about that, are excited about it. And three was that there's much more to this story. And I think we have to make sure that we cover all sides of it, because there's a lot we don't know really on both sides of looking at this investigation.
Well, I'll tell you, one thing I remember you being really shocked at was when he admitted to you at the end of the interview that if he hadn't been fired, he would still love to be the FBI director today. And that That surprised you, I could tell.
Well, I mean, for all the things he was saying on other networks about the current commander-in-chief, if he really wanted to stay in that job, that's quite something.
Yeah, but he said something about, well, I needed to stay there in order to protect my beloved FBI from this rogue. Those are my words, not his. But
right. And that was shocking. Yeah, I think he saw the job differently. And, who knows where this is going to go, but hopefully that added to the conversation of fact. And that's what we're trying to get to.
Well, it was great. I'll tell you, it was informative and it was satisfying. And I know I've talked to a number of people in my audience who watched it that were extremely satisfied with it. So job well done. And look on this book, too. You really do, all joking aside, you have a great thematic format going here with your looks back into history. And as a Reagan acolyte, I loved Ronald Reagan. This book captures him, and particularly this very important element, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the wall, and so forth. You really got it, Brett, and I congratulate. It's well worth reading this and absorbing it for people. Thank you, Rush. And I'm not blowing smoke here, but the same day this comes out tomorrow, a young reader's edition comes out of this book, so your 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grader could read it, too. And the reason I did this, and this is where the blowing smoke thing comes, is because my kids loved your Rush Revere books, and I honestly thought, when I went into this second book, that's really the reason that I'm doing it, is to introduce a president who young people hadn't seen or known about, or moments that adults just didn't know about, to better our look at history. Brett, thank you. You talked right up to the break, like the pro that you are. Thanks much for your time. Back in a moment. See you, Rush. And welcome back, folks. And I have to tell you, I'm depressed today. I made a commitment that I cannot get out of, and I'm not going to be here the next 2 days, and I cannot tell you how it disappoints me. I have enough in today's stack to get 3 days. I have 3 days of material here that I'm going to have to get to whatever we can and set aside what I don't get to. But, man, we're just overflowing today, and 90% of it is awesome, good, and even the negative stuff is pleasing in its own way. I'm backed up here on phone calls as well. Mr. Snerdley, who are the guest hosts that we have tomorrow and Wednesday? So Mark Stein tomorrow, Ken Matthews will be on Wednesday. Then I'm back Thursday, and I'm apologizing in advance. This is why I do not like committing to things months in advance. It's why I usually don't. But this is one of these obligatory things, and I'm just sad that I'm going to be missing the next couple of days. So let's make of this what we can here for the remainder of the time. We're going to start in Heartland, Wisconsin. Nikki, you're first as we hit the phone today. Great to have you.
Hi, Rush. The Russian hoax, it was a setup. I believe you're right from the start. They needed to make the hoax fly, the collusion thing, they had to have Trump connected to Russians. Now, you mentioned the Papadopoulos thing, but then there was the Russian lawyer. The lawyer met with Fusion GPS before the meeting with Donald Trump Jr. at Trump Tower and right after. And then after that, there was the in December, end of December, they were complaining, remember, because Trump didn't want to have daily briefings because it was the same thing over and over again. They were real upset about that. Well, if you remember the meeting with Obama on January 5th, where he met with Brennan and Clapper and Comey, was the day before Comey briefed Trump on the dossier when they leaked that to the media. Well, then they wanted to move on, I think, from that to the obstruction thing, because I remember early on in the administration when he took office, McCabe went to the White House and he cornered Reince Priebus and said to him, well, the FBI knows that's all a bogus, the whole thing with Russia. And when Reince Priebus says, well, how do we straighten that out with the media? McCabe says, well, call me later. And the minute he called them, then they leaked to the media again that the White House is calling them.
Right. Exactly. So they got on Priebus for trying to get the FBI trying to manipulate the FBI. You're so right. In every instance of this, we have setups. practically every element of this investigation results from a setup. And I guess at the root of this, now you may think this is a rhetorical question or a question that answers itself, but stop and think the effort that has gone into denying Donald Trump the presidency, and then after he wins it, doing everything. I mean, these people have thrown the kitchen sink. They have taken every trick in their arsenal and they have deployed it against Donald Trump for the express purpose of getting rid of him, forcing him to resign, lowering his public approval numbers to the point that he had lost all support. This is what they were trying to do. Now, stop just for a moment. We know who these people are. They are the Washington establishment. These are the people who consider themselves elites. These are the people that are better than all the rest of us. And these are people in their minds who run the world. And the United States is nothing but a cog in the whole wheel that is the world. It's nothing. It's one of the biggest. But these people don't have any particular allegiance to it like you and I do in terms of American exceptionalism, moral leadership, moral superiority. To them, it's a golden goose. Economically, it is a vast military power and has the ability to project it. But beyond that, it is nothing more than one of the many elements of the world that they control. And look at the panic. Look at the abject panic at the thought that they might lose control of the United States as they run the world. And that happened during the campaign. Because believe me, at some point during this campaign, they began to believe Trump could win, which is what all of this before the election was about. Remember, all of this started in July of 2016. The election was in November. Now, they were not talking about Russian collusion per se in this era because they didn't want to taint Hillary's win, which they hoped and thought would happen. But they did try to make the case that Trump was colluding with Russia, not Hillary, that the Russians were trying to aid Trump's victory. These people had a genuine fear they were going to lose their grip on controlling the United States as they control the world. And the thought of losing control of the United States sent them into degrees and levels of panic that I don't think we yet fully realize, even though we see it all and all of this registers. And now we've learned, Nikki here is really correct, everything that has ended up making news designed to show Trump colluded or Trump obstructed is the result of setups. Her example of Priebus is great. Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, is in the White House one day, and the news at this particular point in time was intensely anti-Trump. This was the period of time where the deep state was feeding the New York Times and CNN 4 stories a day on Trump-Russia collusion. And Priebus, it was so bad, Priebus came on this show a couple days after all this to try to straighten this out. What happens is Priebus says that Andrew McCabe happens to be in the White House that day and seeks Priebus out, goes to his office, says, look, we know all this stuff in the New York Times. We know it's BS. We know there wasn't any collusion. We know that this didn't happen. And Priebus is dumbstruck. If you know it, why is it being reported? If you know it, why aren't you correcting it? McCabe then tells the media that Priebus was leaning on him to influence the media. McCabe does not tell the media that he happened to seek Priebus out and tell him it's all BS. McCabe tells the media that Priebus sought him out. This is the same thing that happened with Comey and Trump. Comey set Trump up to get the dossier in the news by presenting him the dossier. James Clapper tells Comey to tell Trump about the dossier, and particularly the P story, the golden shower story, because that's what they wanted out there. So Comey has admitted that was his assignment. He tells Trump about the dossier. Clapper then is informed by Comey that mission accomplished. Clapper then tells CNN. And CNN runs a story 4 days later on January 10th that the intelligence community has shown President Trump this dossier and are very concerned about it. And it put it flat out right there in the news, and it was nothing more than a setup. And CNN, back in May, maybe late April, got an award from the White House Correspondents Association for this daring, brave, breaking news, which was nothing more than a setup engineered by James Clapper, who lied about it and then didn't lie about it, and then who ended up being hired by CNN. So you could even say that Clapper was paid to do this in the end. Then the story of George Papadopoulos, who, after the Carter Page angle bombed out as the supposed reason for this investigation, the reason for the FISA warrant, then they set up George Papadopoulos, a little peripheral foreign policy so-called advisor. He wasn't even that. He was just, I don't mean to diminish Papadopoulos, please don't misunderstand, but in the big scheme, he was not a player. But he was spotted as somebody that wanted to be a player. So he was cultivated by British intelligence, and who we now know as the British informant or spy the FBI was using, and they implant information with Papadopoulos that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton hacked emails. They tell him this. Effectively, the FBI and their associates in the United Kingdom tell Papadopoulos this. That was to set up a meeting that they arranged with Papadopoulos and the Australian ambassador at a bar in London, in which Papadopoulos, after having too much to drink, starts bragging about what he knows to the Australian ambassador. The Russians have a whole bunch of hacked Hillary Clinton emails. This allows the Australian ambassador ostensibly to call the CIA and the FBI. Guess what? I just heard from a Trump campaign official that the Russians have hacked Hillary Clinton emails and the Trump campaign knows about it. Papadopoulos didn't know anything. They told him. That then triggered the current phase of this investigation, as announced by the New York Times over New Year's weekend in a very lengthy story. This is, as I say, the Cliff Notes version of this. But the point is, none of this is real. It was all set up. To call it entrapment is maybe a little bit much, because entrapment is used to get somebody you know is guilty. This was just circular firing squad, in a sense, circular intel, if you will. They plant, essentially, what they want to be attributed to the Trump administration. They plant it in a peripheral Trump foreign policy advisor. Then they arrange a meeting for him with an Australian ambassador, who then hears this news, and we're off to the races. And none of it is real. None of it. And the collusion has fallen apart, and the obstruction. There isn't any obstruction. The president cannot obstruct by doing his constitutional duties. So what we're left with here is look at the lengths to which these people have gone to, A, prevent Trump from winning, and then after that, doing their best to get rid of him, to force him to resign, to force all public support to abandon him. This desire to control the United States. You know, Brett Baer's book, the parallels here between Reagan and the Soviet Union and Trump and North Korea and Trump and Israel and Trump and foreign policy, they're eerie. Because in both cases, you have legitimate outsiders. Though Reagan was from politics, he was a governor of California. But as far as the Washington establishment was concerned, including the Washington conservative establishment, Reagan was a no-go. Reagan was a nonconformist. Reagan did not see the New World Order the way these people did. Reagan did not see the United States as a gigantic part of the world. He saw the United States for what it is, and posed a threat for 8 years to these people who think they run the world. And when I say run the world, it's what I literally mean it, folks. And the lengths to which they have all gone here, making things up, creating what are false realities. It's no wonder this thing is imploding, and it will. I mean, there's no foundation here. There's nothing for these people to fall back on unless they can create crimes in their investigation, which is exactly what they're trying to do. No, I started looking into all this when it was last week. Kimberly Strassel, Washington Post, alluding to the fact that the FBI had an informant in the Trump campaign, a spy. Damn right, I'm tracking that down. And I wasn't, Kimberly Strassel didn't want to identify who it was until she could have it confirmed by intelligence sources. After I found out who it was, it doesn't matter who it was. I mean, the name is not a household name for most people in this country. It doesn't matter who it was. What they did. And damn right, when I found out they're spying, when they're informing, when they are planting, when they're setting people up. And it's not just the FBI and the DOJ, folks. This involves UK MI6 people. This involves UK academics, which are Oxford and MI6 are practically inseparable. Oxford University. Well, Obama's fingerprints. I don't think Obama's fingerprints need to be on it unless you want to say that Brennan and Clapper were doing Obama's works. But they didn't need Obama's fingerprints. These people, that's my point. These people didn't need a memo from Obama to do this. This was instinctively something they had to do to protect themselves. They simply cannot allow for somebody like this to come in and win and accomplish things. They just can't permit it. It undercuts a lifetime of work that they have done to condition people to have low expectations about major achievements that would improve life around the world and in the United States. They have done everything they can to sustain themselves as the only people qualified to deal with these humongous, big, and complex issues. And creating complexity is primarily what they do. They manufacture complexity because that then eliminates a large number of people from even being qualified to deal with it. And if you'll notice, if you notice people referring to Obama and his brilliance, they talk about his ability to deal with the complexities of the world. These are manufactured complexities, all to service the notion that only they are bright enough to navigate these complexities. And here, they can't allow somebody they think is a simpleton to come in here and demonstrate that they have created a house of cards. They're in the process of being exposed as a bunch of pseudo-intellectual, phony intellectual frauds. And they know it, and they're in panic mode about it. And it double grates on them that the person exposing them is somebody they personally detest because of the way he talks, the way he communicates, his manners or lack of, in their view, his behavior, his lack of sophistication. Donald Trump, and to a lesser extent Reagan, really put the lie to the idea that only a select few and a very rare kind of person is qualified to deal with all of these massively complex problems that we face in the world. Trump is showing that's all a crock. And they're being exposed. It's like Trump is taking an article of clothing off of them each week, and they have no ability to put their clothes back on. We'll be back in a moment. Folks, the special counsel himself is the result of a setup. James Comey's supposed memos that he wrote after his meetings with Trump were written expressly to create enough noise that we would have to have a special counsel. Everything about... we are racing through the 3 busy broadcast hours today. Rush Limbaugh, great to have you. 800-282-2882. We're going to be getting to phone calls as soon as we can here. A lot of you have been on hold for a long time. And again, I really apologize. I'm going to be out these next 2 days, and I just feel sick about it. This is why I do not, for all of you thinking of inviting me to do something in October, November, this is exactly why I don't usually do it. Do not schedule things way in advance. You just never know what's going to be coming up. There's a lot of stuff out there in addition to that which we have broken wide open so far today. San Francisco Chronicle, Willie Brown, the former Speaker of the California Assembly, the former mayor of San Francisco, and a leftist activist, had a piece that ran a couple days ago. Trump is more popular than Democrats want to admit. Like it or not, a significant number of Americans are actually happy these days. They're making money, they feel safe, and they agree with the president's trade policies. They agree with his call for more American jobs, even his immigration stance. The jobs growth reports in North Korea summit, the steady economy are beating out the Stormy Daniels scandal and the Robert Mueller investigation in Middle America, hands down. So you're not going to win back the House by taking it all or making it all about Trump. Rather than stoking the base by attacking Trump, Democrats need to come up with a platform that addresses the average voter's hopes and concerns, not just the needs of underdogs or whatever cause happens to be the media flavor of the week. Democrats need to look like the adults, not like another pack of screaming kids on the playground, and they need to start now. That's Willie Brown. And I'm telling you, he's right on the money. And this characterization need to look like the adults, not another pack of screaming kids on the playground. That's as much directed at CNN and MSNBC as it is to any Democrat Party member or activist. He clearly sees what is happening, and it's nothing leading to a blue wave. In fact, you're starting to see some stories out there today, people predicting a red wave. And that the red is going to be blood from defeated Democrats. But the problem the Democrats have is they cannot admit their agenda and hope to win. They're caught. This is why they spend so much time beating up Trump as incompetent, as whatever they're saying about him. And it isn't working. They're not stopping him, folks. They have not slowed him down. They're not stopping Donald Trump at all. They can't abandon this and switch to a promotion of their own agenda because they're too busy trying to portray themselves as moderates when they are not. There aren't any moderates left in the Democrat Party or the American left. The American Democrat Party is as radical as the American left is. And if they try to moderate, they're going to infuriate their base, which is where their donations come from. It doesn't help that one of their big donors, this guy Tom Steyer, is out now accusing Trump of morphing into Hitler and his supporters, his voters, as supporters of Hitler. You know, Selena Zito has a new book out, too, that we've been talking about. One of the things she characterizes Trump voters into 7 different categories. One of the 7 categories features people who love Trump, who voted for Obama twice. Well, here the Democrats are trying to portray Trump voters as Hitler youth, Hitler-like, a bunch of racists and sexists and bigots, and yet many Trump voters also voted for Barack Obama. And when they see and hear the way they're being characterized, makes them mad. A backlash is brewing. David Brooks, New York Times ostensible conservative columnist, something's happened. Something has happened. Let me just read a couple of excerpts from his latest piece called Donald Trump's Lizard Wisdom. And yet, I can't help but wonder if that kind of background has provided a decent education for dealing with the sort of hopped-up mobsters running parts of the world today. There is growing reason to believe that Donald Trump understands the thug mind a whole lot better than the people who attended our prestigious foreign service academies. First piece of evidence, North Korea. When Trump was trading crude back-alley swipes with little rocket man about whose nuclear button was bigger, it sounded as if we were headed for a nuclear holocaust led by a pair of overgrown prepubescents. But in fact, Trump's bellicosity seems to have worked. It's impossible to know how things will pan out, but the situation with North Korea today is a lot better than it was 6 months ago. And the only person treating it any differently than it's been treated the last 40 years is Donald Trump. Maybe Trump is right to intuit that the only right response to a monster is to enclose it. Maybe he's right that when you sense economic weakness and a potential threat that you hit it again. Second piece of evidence, our trade talks with China over the past few decades. The Western diplomatic community made a big bet. If we all behave decently toward the Chicoms, then they'd naturally come to embrace liberal economic and cultural values. We could all eventually share a Pinot at the university club. The bet went wrong. The president has pushed back harder on the Chicoms and has netted some results. After some Trump swagger, Xi Jinping promised to significantly lower Chinese tariffs on imported vehicles. This, folks, I can't, because Brooks is one of these guys. Now, he's a media denizen, but he's still one of these guys who thinks that he and his buddies are the betters of the world. They are the rare and unique, brilliant elitists. Only they are capable of running the world, of policing and navigating the world order. And how many times have they been proven wrong over the years, and yet they still have standing? Reagan proved them wrong. Trump is proving them wrong. They themselves demonstrate their own ineffectiveness. How many years have they been negotiating Middle East peace, for example, and not a single acre has changed. Not a single bit of movement has happened. Nothing is different. Take any diplomatic effort you want, and these people believe the United States is the problem, that if we would just tone it down, that if we would just say we understand. Look at after 9/11. These are the people that had the forums at the State Department asking, what did we do to make them hate us? As these people run the world, they always seem to conclude the United States is at the center of the problems. And you know why? Because we're so much more economically wealthy. Something about that makes them feel inherently guilty. Something about that makes them need to cut us down in size. It's not fair. Just that great inequity itself in their world makes it impossible for us to be liked and respected. This is a sick bunch of people, folks, and this has been educated into them. It's been bred into them. They're born into families that believe this garbage. They're raised this way. They're educated this way. They come out of their Ivy League schools knowing how to dress, how to speak, how to act, how to think, and it's uniform. They're all identical. They're cookie cutters. They all think the same. They have the same reaction to every event in the news. Doesn't matter. Same thing in the media. Same reaction. No diversity of thought, diversity of mannerism, diversity of belief. New York Times columnist reporters miss important stories because they are obsessed with Trump. This is New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof. Jimmy Kimmel, he's in New York to do the stand-up routine this week for ABC's Upfront advertising push. Says he's not going to be hitting Trump in his stand-up routine, that people have had enough of Trump bashing. Saturday Night Live is starting to be criticized for its one-note samba on Trump, how it's become predictable, it has become boring, but more importantly, it isn't working. Colbert is not taking Trump out. Kimmel hasn't taken Trump out. Jimmy Fallon hasn't taken Trump out. Jimmy Kimmel hasn't. None of these people have. Saturday Night Live has not damaged Donald Trump. So now all of a sudden they're saying, well, maybe we become too predictable. Maybe this, maybe the American people are tired of it. They want us to move on. It's only because they're ineffective. Story from thehill.com. Democrats worry Trump will win over economy. Democrats are growing worried the strong economy, Trump's messaging about his economic stewardship will help Republicans to this year's midterm elections. Notice, wherever you look, talk of the blue wave has evaporated. And now there are stories the Democrats have overstepped, the Democrats have overextended, the Democrats have expectations way out of line with reality. Generic ballot is narrowed to where Democrats do not have a lead in it anymore. Their whole world is in the process being turned upside down. Another New York Times column, Liberals, You're Not As Smart As You Think, written by a liberal, Gerald Alexander, professor of political science, University of Virginia. And this piece is all about the backlash that is just starting against the American left for their irresponsible behavior and singular focus on Trump and how it's bombing out with mainstream America. Don't worry. The left isn't going to listen to any of this stuff. They're incapable of changing their tune about Trump. It's just that some worried types are now beginning to write about it. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to come back. I have one more story, and then we're going to get to the phones. This next story, if you live in Illinois and you don't know what I'm going to tell you next, you had better be prepared to be rocked and shocked, because you have no idea what's coming. I'll give you a hint. The Chicago Federal Reserve, working with the government of Illinois, in order to protect and fund the unfunded pensions of union and public employees, the mechanism by which to save those pensions is going to be the destruction of the value of your home. Wait till you hear this. Do not go away. Oh, I promise phone calls are coming up. If you're on hold, I want you to stay there because I'm looking forward to talking to you. The Chicago Federal Reserve has unveiled its solution to the pension problem. A speaker from the Chicago Fed. This was at an event that was sponsored by, it was last month, sponsored by the Civic Federation and the Federal Reserve Bank Chicago. Illinois has unfunded liabilities, particularly on pensions, that are off the charts. A speaker from the Chicago Fed proposed levying across the state, and in addition to current property taxes, a special property assessment they estimate would be about 1% of actual property value every year for 30 years. Homeowners with houses worth $250,000 would pay an additional $2,500 per year in taxes. Those with homes worth $500,000 would pay an additional $5,000 a year. Those with homes worth $1 million would pay an additional $10,000 a year for 30 years, on top of existing taxes. Furthermore, you would not be able to escape this by selling your house and leaving. You know why? You're not going to be able to sell your house. Nobody's going to buy your house in Chicago with this kind of taxation on it. And the people that come up with these rules, this is the reasoning from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. New taxes would not affect people thinking of moving to Illinois. While they would have to pay higher property taxes, that would be offset by not having to pay as much for their new homes. In addition, current homeowners would not be able to avoid the new tax by selling their homes and moving, because home prices should reflect the new tax burden quickly. In other words, they fully expect the value of you in Chicago and Illinois who own your homes, the value of those homes to plummet with the application of these new property taxes. So people arriving in the state are going to be able to afford your house because you're going to have to practically give it away, which means you're going to lose every bit of equity and wealth you have in your house if you try to sell it and leave. Current homeowners would not be able to avoid the new tax by selling their homes and moving because home prices should reflect the new tax burden. That means nobody's going to want to buy. They're admitting that the dynamic results of this is going to be to destroy the Illinois housing market. But that they have to do it to come up with some money to help fund underfunded pensions. So in other words, they're just going to confiscate wealth from current homeowners because they will pay, whether they stay or not, through an immediate reduction in home value. This proposed tax will only address 5 state pensions. There are 650 other pensions in Illinois, particularly those who overlap jurisdictions in Chicago, which are grossly underfunded. They do not understand that people will not build on or improve property when property taxes are that high. Why would you undertake any effort to expand, remodel, or otherwise increase the value of your home when you will be facing an additional 1% property tax on it in addition to everything else for 30 years? And these are not insignificant sums of money that people already don't have, and now they're going to have to come just to find. And by the way, this, it is stated here, will property values in Illinois, by the way, are already 5% of home values in some cases. But what is it? Maybe that's another story. This is only going to, no, that's Seattle, a different story. Different story. They have a per employee tax they're voting on in Seattle, which is causing Amazon to stop building the new headquarters. These socialist-run places are in the midst of destroying themselves. They've got these unfunded pensions in Illinois, massive property tax increases, and you can't even escape it by selling your house and moving because you probably won't be able to sell your house. Because who's going to want to buy these, new effective tax rates? It's just mind-boggling here. Anyway, back to the phones we go. This is Barbara. She's in Dayton, Ohio. I'm glad you waited. Welcome to the EIB Network. Hi.
Hi. Gee, it's fun to talk to you, Rush.
Thank you.
I guess I'm old because I remember Watergate. I was a young mother and interested in politics then, but not like I am now. But trying to follow this it's a maze. I don't understand, and I mean this sincerely, I don't understand why this isn't taught it the same way that Watergate was. This seems to me to be far worse when our own government is willing to put...
Well, wait. There's a simple answer to that. Why isn't... Watergate was to get rid of Richard Nixon. This is exactly what Watergate is. The same people, the objective here is to get rid of Trump. This is far worse than what Watergate was. Watergate, you're wondering why this isn't being exposed. It's because the people who would expose it are complicit in it. The media is complicit in this. The New York Times wrote the long story that recast the beginning of this investigation, centering on George Papadopoulos and not Carter Page and the FISA warrant about the Steele dossier. They are complicit. That's the point. Well, the media was also complicit in getting Nixon at Watergate. They're actually pretty parallel, except Watergate is romper room compared to what this is. And Barbara, you're not too old to understand this. This is, if you don't understand it, it's because I've not done a good enough job explaining this, because this is really simple to understand. It might take me 2 or 3 times explaining it, but at its heart, this thing is very simple. It's hard to believe maybe that people would do it, would go to these lengths. It's not for me to believe that, but understanding what has been done here is not complex. Look, in Watergate, the media and the American left exposed what they said was corruption with Richard Nixon and his people in the White House. With this, essentially what the media is trying to cover is corruption in the investigation. The media is attempting to cover up corruption in the FBI, in the DOJ, the CIA, all of the investigatory agencies that are trying to run this scam. The media is, I guess it's in a sense they're trying to expose the so-called corruption of the Trump campaign and presidency with collusion with Russia and obstruction. But what's really going on right now, the Mueller investigation is simply a deflection. It's a cover-up of everything that has been done to portray Trump as this colluder and somebody who's obstructing. And they're also trying to get people to commit crimes during the process of the investigation. There's no way that they're going to ever impeach Donald Trump. They're not going to get rid of him constitutionally. The only hope they've got is to force him to resign, which was the original objective of this. They thought they could do it in 6 months, destroy him, ruin his reputation, destroy public support, get it down to the 20s. The next thing, they want to get an interview. If they can get Trump lying to them, they call a process crime, lying to the FBI. But in terms of impeachment, ain't no way, Jose, isn't going to happen. There's no way the Senate is going to two-thirds vote to get rid of Trump, not in the midst of all of these successes. It just isn't going to happen. And that's why panic is setting in. Okay, Sam in Green Bay. Great to have you, sir. I'm glad you waited.
Hi, Rush. You talked about the midterm elections a little bit earlier in the show, and I've never been interested in politics until Donald Trump became the president. I've never voted in a midterm election, but this year I will vote straight Republican because I have found out how crazy the Democratic policies are. Russ, do you feel thousands of people might feel the same way I do?
I do, and I'll tell you why. It's because of Selena Zito's latest book. She was the first national reporter to actually go into areas of blue states that had all the Trump yard signs in them. It was a phenomenon. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, these places everybody thought were locks for Hillary Clinton. Wherever you go, there's Trump yard signs. She went to these states, to the areas of these states who were going to vote for Trump. And she found 7 different categories of voter, including among the 7 people that had voted for Obama twice. And there were people like you who had given up on politics because they thought their vote didn't count. They thought Washington didn't listen to them. It didn't matter. They thought politicians campaigned every 2 years, every 4 years, but then forgot about them after the election, both parties. So there's a lot of people like you. I mean, you look at the turnout in midterms or presidential elections, and it's nowhere near 100%. There's a lot of people like you. And I think Trump has ignited interest in a lot of them simply because he's the only politician to come down the pike who seems to be aware of things that either they care about, things that they're interested in, things they believe are causing them troubles. He's the only politician to address them and have solutions. And because of that, they cut him a lot of slack on all the other stuff. The tweets, the way he speaks, some of his insults, they don't care. Because many of these people look and see a country in crisis. And that's an interesting thing, too. If you go to Washington and talk to anybody there in the political class of either party, go to K Street, talk to the lobbyists, go to any of the bureaucracies, you will not find a soul who thinks the country's in crisis. And if you tell them a lot of people think the country's in crisis and they ask why, well, immigration is one issue. Whoa, come on. They immediately think that's just a bunch of racism. It's just Americans that don't like people of color coming in. That's what they honestly tell themselves. They have no clue. They have no concept that people's concern about illegal immigration is the destruction to the distinct American culture that exists. that they don't see any desire to assimilate. They see the country balkanizing as illegal immigration continues. They see sanctuary cities and states, and they're repulsed by them. They're appalled by them. They don't hear any politicians objecting to it, trying to stop it. They hear, in fact, most politicians trying to support it one way or the other. So, yeah, a lot of people in your shoes out there. This is Fred in Cleveland. It's great to have you, sir. How are you doing?
I'm good, Rush. Good day to you. My point today, I think that everything we're witnessing revolves around the Inspector General's report. I think it's going to be a political earthquake, and the higher-ups all know it. Schumer, Pelosi, Schiff, everybody knows it. The secret is out. They know what is coming. And I think the reason Trump will not declassify everything and drop the bombshell and let the floodgates open is he's controlling the floodgates. He knows that when the Inspector General and all these texts between Strzok and Page and everyone else is publicized and everyone sees, the floodgates are going to open, and it's going to be a complete offensive blitz on the Trump campaign. And I see the Democrats running for the hills. The blue wave has turned into a blue puddle, and the red wave has turned into a 60-foot tsunami that's in the middle of the Pacific right now, that's going to hit shore in November.
Well, I tell you, this is a question that comes up. It's on the minds of a lot of people. We're sitting here. You know, I spent a lot of hours on Saturday putting together my explanation for who is the spy, what's the spy, why was he a spy, what was he doing, at the George Papadopoulos story. And the fact remains that Donald Trump, with one phone call, could make all of it public. He could order all of this that's redacted to be unredacted and declassified, and therefore reported. So the question is, why doesn't he? And theories abound. Your theory is he's waiting on the IG, that the IG, the actual Inspector General of the DOJ and the FBI, tell the tale, so that Trump is not accused of doing so. In fact, this came up on Fox, grab soundbites 1 and 2. David Asman had Kim Strassel on Friday afternoon, and he presented my theory to her for her to react to.
Rush Limbaugh weighed in on this today. He suggested that it may be more than just concern that the president has about being accused of obstruction of justice, that there's something else afoot. Let's play the Rush Limbaugh take.
Mueller doesn't have any power whatsoever to get rid of Donald Trump constitutionally. And they're not going to try it that way. This is all about humiliation, embarrassment, raising his negative numbers, hopefully to make him resign. That's not going to happen. And Trump knows it's not going to happen. But the analogy is that he's David, they're all Goliath. We know how that story ends, meaning that it's not correct to say Trump likes playing the victim, but by having this still remain mysterious, unredacted, Trump gets to hit all of this as a witch hunt. He gets to continue to categorize these people the way he wants to and prolong, because he knows what the outcome is going to be, so he's just simply prolonging it. Here's Kim Strassel's reaction to that theory.
Well, he is doing that, but the question I think we all have is, would it still not be better to declassify this as soon as we could, and to the extent that we could? The country has lived under this cloud for a very long time. We've lost a lot of important faith in institutions like the FBI and the Department of Justice. Many people there, by the way, who do very good work. And the only way we're going to ever put this behind it is for everything to get out and for the people to be able to judge it for themselves, and then for some judgments to be made and some promises of renewal going forward.
And a lot of people are fully behind that. Just declassify this stuff and let's see what's going to end this. It's gone on too long and there's no end in sight. I understand the point of view. I really do. Back here in just a second, my friends. Hang on. Columbus, Ohio. Next, Dan, glad you called, sir. Great to have you here.
Thanks for taking my call, Rush. I just wanted to mention I had this theory back, I guess, in February when it was revealed that Carter Page was the subject of the FISA warrant.
Yep.
I don't think that that Carter Page was necessarily an informant. I kind of think that he was used as a setup. I think that
that's right. He was not an informant.
Right. The FBI sent him in there to start the conversations about Russia, to get people in the campaign with Russia in the campaign. So that gave, and I think that he had full knowledge the whole time, just my theory, that he would have the FISA warrant issued to him. And I think it's important to note as well that it was a FISA 1 warrant, which is the most severe type of FISA warrant, which meant Carter Page was actually like a walking wiretap. Anybody that he talked to while he was under that FISA warrant would have then been able to be surveilled by the FBI as well.
Exactly, except the problem was that Carter Page had no link to any Russians who were colluding with Trump in the election. He was simply set up and used as a potential to get the FISA warrant, and it was a lot of it based on the Steele dossier, which was then exposed as fraudulent, so Carter Page was forgotten about. His name is not even talked about anymore, replaced by Papadopoulos and that whole story. Gotta go. Back and wrap it up after this. Once again, my friends, I am out tomorrow and Wednesday. We have Mark Stein tomorrow, Ken Matthews on Wednesday, and I'll be back on Thursday. I tried. It's an obligation commitment that I made, and I have to honor it. I'd rather be here, to tell you the truth. See you on Thursday.